Good evening, folks. Welcome back to Play Chess, and I'd like to begin with last week's problem. Remember, this was the only problem that Paul Morphy ever created, and I just want to quickly give you the solution. You've been studying it all week, and some of you have sent answers in, and we're going to announce the winners very shortly in an upcoming program. The correct solution to this, white to move and mate in 2, was rook all the way up here to h6. Now please note carefully. Now it's black's move. Black has to move. Black cannot take the pawn because of the check. If black were to take the rook, checkmate. You notice the checkmate? Pawn attacks the king. The king cannot take it because it's protected by the king. So that's a checkmate there. What other moves has black got? Either to move this or to move the bishop. If the bishop moves away, it leaves this unprotected, and that's checkmate. So the correct answer was rook to king rook 6 or rook to h6. And it's white mates in 2 moves. I hope you like these little chess problems, and I'll have more for you as the series continues. But right now, let's get back to our discussion of the evolution of chess ideas. As I'm setting up the board, remember last week we went from the romantic age of the great combinational players like Philidor and Anderson, Saint-Amand, Labourdonnais, and the rest. And we discovered a young boy down in New Orleans by the name of Paul Morphy, who had new ideas about the game of chess. And for a short 2 years, when he toured Europe and he beat everybody that he could find, he introduced into the game of chess a new concept. And that was the idea of positional play. And this evening we'll continue to discuss what do we mean by positional chess and how did it evolve from Morphy's day. The first thing I want to discuss is where we were missing a bishop. First thing we want to discuss is the difference between the open game and the closed game. Now, we said last week that Paul Morphy was the one who taught us all the ideas of the open game of chess. If we look over here at our previous sheet, we'll remember these principles that we learned from his games. He played in the 1850s. He taught us how to play open positions. And his 3 maxims were that in the opening, every move must be a developing move. You get your pieces out early. You get them towards the center. You don't waste time. His second maxim, that the side with the better development should strive for the open position. In other words, if you have more force in the center than your opponent, you should try and open the position, even if it means sacrificing a pawn or something. The side that has the worst development should therefore try to keep the position locked and closed. A lot of players will try and gain freedom by opening up the position, and that's wrong. They should try and they should say to the person with the better development, all right, you've won the opening, you've got the better position, now it's up to you to prove that you have the win, and wait for him to come at you. Play defensive chess. The third maxim, the side that is cramped must seek freedom by exchanging pieces, not by pushing pawns. Remember, we showed you a nice game that Morphy played in which one of his opponents tried to gain freedom by pushing a pawn, and how quickly Morphy was able to take advantage of that because he had more force in the center. So these are the main ideas for open positions. And what is an open position? Let's look at our board over here. An open position is basically if the pawn structure on both sides after several moves looks like this. 3 and 3. The 2 center pawns, say, are traded off. The game is wide open. The bishops are free to move. The knights are free to move. Everything is free to go anywhere you would like it to go. That is an open position. You can have half-open positions, which could look like this. And there's a trade of pawns here in the center. This is a half-open, but that would be an open game also, because there is maneuverability by knights and bishops in the center. But what would happen if we had an opening such as this? We call it the French defense. Now it's white's move, and white has the options. An interesting thing to remember is that white always has that initiative in the very opening stages of having the move. White can exchange pawns. If he does exchange pawns, black, we might as well say, has an equal game because the game is open. It's an open game. And having an open game, he then follows Paul Morphy's rules for the open game. Quick development, and if you have the better development, you strive for the open position, etc., etc. That's if the pawns are exchanged. If the pawn is not exchanged, but if this knight were to come out to protect that pawn, black may want to take this, and it would be a half-open position. You notice the pawn's situation on half-open files. Knights and bishops are fairly free. But say white were to make a move like this in this position and were to push that pawn. That locks up the center, doesn't it? Locks up the center. And that will lead to a closed game. The bishops will have difficulty in finding room to move. You notice how the white squares and the black squares in the center are locked. They're static. There are several things that will happen now. Black will try to counterattack on this side, hitting the base of this chain. These are called pawn chains. And you always attack a chain at its base. We'll be discussing this later. Or he may seek freedom over here by exchanging off, trying to open the game in some way by exchanging the pawns. But white has produced a closed game. So basically what we're talking about, the difference between an open and a closed game, is an open game, the bishops particularly have scope to maneuver. In a closed game, there are pawns which are locked up in the center, and the bishops do not have much maneuverability. Now, with the advent of Paul Morphy, and as masters came to understand his principles, what would happen is that these open games that were prevalent at the time, that the masters loved to play, the romantic combinational style players, they soon discovered that by applying Morphy's three maxims for the open game, that there were a lot of draw games coming about. And why? Because they were both developing quickly, and with both forces trying for the same thing, there was balance created. They were becoming proficient in understanding the very crudest traps that were available. And many of the open games became drawish. And a lot of people thought, well, that's the end of our game of chess. We understand Morphy's principles. It's going to lead to a draw game if you play correctly. Now, about this time, in the late 1800s, young Wilhelm Steinitz from Austria, he was playing, like the others, combinational chess. And he is our very first chess professional. He devoted his entire life to the study of the game of chess. And he approached the game as a scientist would approach his field of inquiry. He wanted to try and understand what it was about a position, any position, that demanded certain moves. He wanted to understand what was the idea inherent in each position in chess. And understanding the idea, hopefully one would be able to select the best move. He moved to England, where there were some very strong chess players, and he did visit the United States, and Steinitz wrote some very informative books. but mostly he was a great match player. He studied his opponents, he knew their opening repertoire, and he was ready for them when he played in matches. Unlike many other players, like the players of today, Steinitz didn't play in tournaments. In the few he did play, he didn't fare very well. But in match play, head-on-head with one player for a series of games, he was very hard to beat. He eventually had a match with Anderson, our old friend Adolf Anderson from Germany, and he defeated him, and he became recognized as the very first world's chess champion, Wilhelm Steinitz. Now, what we get from Steinitz is the theory of the closed game. He would not open up the game in the center as readily as Morphy would. He wanted to close the game, to lock up the pawns, to maneuver his pieces behind the lines, back and forth. But his whole idea was to so maneuver his pieces in a closed position, so in such a way that it could erupt with great force at any time that he saw a weakness in the enemy camp. So he would keep a closed defensive center, maneuver his pieces in such a way that they were coordinating with each other, and he was ready for any mistake that his enemy would make, no matter how small that mistake was. This was the beginning of the scientific school of chess, and it logically follows that of Morphy, because Morphy, who gave us the principles of the open game, was followed by Steinitz, who gave us the very early principles of the closed game. And much of chess, since the days of Steinitz, has been an evolution of his ideas, the theory of the closed game. I have some notes over here which will bring you up to date with what I've been trying to say. In our history of chess development, up to the 1800s, we had Anderson-type combinational chess. We refer to this as the Romantic era of chess. And then in 1857 comes along Paul Morphy, the first positional player, but a positional player who showed us the ideas behind the open game of chess. Then in the late 1800s, Wilhelm Steinitz, who gave us positional ideas for the closed game and the birth of the scientific school of chess. From Morphy, then, we learn that if you have greater mobility of your pieces and effective coordination. Now, what do we mean by effective coordination? We mean that if you have a bishop and a knight, let them attack different colored squares rather than the same colored squares. In other words, you have fewer pieces attacking more of the board. That's what we call effective coordination. So if you have these pluses on your side, this ought to lead to a combination. This will lead back to the days of Anderson, which is what we want. But we want to arrive at the combination through a logical process. So we strive for greater mobility and effective coordination, and hopefully arrive at a combination which will end up in a mate. From Steinitz, if the open positions are played well by both sides, it will lead to a draw. So what does he do? He keeps the position tight, and he looks for structural advantages or disadvantages in his opponent's camp, and this is what we'll be discussing. What are structural advantages and disadvantages? And then he'll open the game, returning to Morphy's style, only after he's inflicted permanent weaknesses in his opponent's side. Now, if we turn to the board, I would like to show you something as to what I mean by structural weaknesses. A doubled pawn is a weakness. Triple pawn is terrible. If you picture just two kings on the board and some pawns, notice how the enemy king can approach these in the endgame and just take them one by one. But pawns that are protecting each other cannot be taken, you see. Double pawns are very weak. The isolated pawn is considered a weakness. A pawn that does not have another pawn on either side to come and protect it. That's considered a weakness. If you have a position like this and a big hole right here, and white can place a knight, say, in that hole, you notice no pawn can come up and chase the knight away. That knight becomes very strong. That is what we call a disadvantage or a structural weakness in black's camp. Now, there are many, many types of positional weaknesses, and what we must do in our subsequent series, chess lectures, is to study what are these weaknesses, how to provoke them, how to cause them, and how to take advantage of them, which is most important. Now, if we look over here, we'll see how Steinitz attacked this problem. He had a plan, all right, a five-point plan. In the opening, keep a tight and defensive center, accumulate advantages. What do we mean by that? Advantages are such as I just showed you. We must learn how to spot them. This gives us an idea of what we must study. We must learn how to produce them, and we must be able to know how to trade one advantage on our side for even greater advantages. Perhaps an isolated pawn will lead to the win of material, the win of a pawn, you see. Now, we accumulate these advantages. Once these advantages are accumulated, they ought to lead to a combination. A combination, remember, is probably the sacrifice of a piece or the opening up of lines, anything to lead to the opponent's king. This leads to a one-ending or a mating attack with an eventual mate. So the important thing, keep the opening tight and defensive in Steinitz's style. We're studying Steinitz, don't forget. And learn what are advantages and disadvantages. We must study the positional characteristics which are advantages. This is the key term, the positional characteristics of a game. And we will come to understand this. I have this little game between Steinitz and Chigorin. Chigorin was the Russian chess champion of the day, and the USSR today still claim that he is the father of the modern school of chess. But he did lag a bit behind in theory from some of the greats such as Steinitz, although he was in his own right a great chess player. But let's look at this little game between Steinitz and Chigorin. Steinitz is white, Chigorin is black. And it's a double king-pawn opening, such as this. The knight comes out, this knight comes out. The knight is attacking the pawn, the knight is protecting the pawn. And we have what we have called before the Roy Lopez. Remember, this goes back, we said, to the 1400s, to the Spanish cleric, Roy Lopez. Attacking the knight. Remember, if the knight is taken, leaves this pawn weak. Chigorin then plays what we know now as the Berlin defense, counterattacks in the center. Now, Morphy would, in this position, make some move which would attempt to play pawn to queen 4 in order to open the game. Open the game. Steinitz, however, plays pawn to queen 3, which is going to be a closed type position. He protects his pawn from this knight. Black plays pawn to queen 3, wants to get this bishop opened up. And now Morphy plays a move that was unknown at that time. He plays pawn to queen bishop 3. When it's on the other side of the board, it's sometimes called today the Boleslavsky wall, for those who are interested and who I know do play chess out there. You can also get it here on the white side. You notice how the center is protected by this pawn. The knight cannot come in here now. There's a pawn protecting the center. This pawn is protected by this one. This is a closed, tight center. The problem is, how is white going to develop his pieces? It is certainly uncharacteristic of the Morphy style. This knight cannot now come here. where Morphy would like to bring it. It's going to be difficult to see how white can develop his pieces. But the thing we must remember is that we're studying now the principles of the closed game. Black now has a problem with his king-bishop. How has he developed his king-bishop? This pawn keeps it in. He decides against this move, and he decides to bring this pawn up in order to bring his bishop here and then castle. This is called a fianchettoed bishop. Fianchetto is the Italian term. It's when you make this little hole on the king's side or on the queen's side, and you bring the bishop in here to protect the black squares that you've weakened by the removal of this pawn. So Chigorin plays pawn to king knight 3. Now, Steinitz comes knight to queen 2. You notice he has no other, he's not going to develop his knight towards the side. There's no future for it over there, and it's not a center move. He's going to maneuver his knight to this square, and then either to this one or to this one. Notice how he gets his knight towards the center, towards these squares, by this maneuver. It has now become popular in this Roy Lopez opening, but it was Steinitz who first discovered this maneuver, because the knight usually was placed right out here in open games. Knight to queen 2. Queen knight to queen 2. The bishop comes out in the fianchetto position. Now, Morphy probably would have castled. Some other people of that era would have castled. But Steinitz isn't sure whether he wants to castle kingside or queenside yet. But he does know he wants to get this knight in a good position and free his bishop. He moves immediately down here to f1 so that he can bring it up to either square. Seems like a waste of time, but it's not a waste of time as long as the center is locked. You must remember that. You cannot afford to maneuver one piece so many times in the opening if it's an open game. Remember I said, Morphy said that in the opening, every move must be a developing move. That's in an open game. But in a closed game, you can afford the time to maneuver and jockey for position. Chigorin then castles. And bishop back here. He could have come up here immediately, but he brings this bishop back here, heading for either this square or back here for eventual pawn to queen 4. Eventually, he's going to head for an open style game. I want you to look at these moves very carefully, and even if we can't get through this evening, we can continue the game at another time. I'll see how far we can go. But it's very important in our future study of chess to understand what we're doing in this closed position. The bishop comes back there. Now, the knight, Chigorin moves his knight. The black really doesn't have too much to do here. He's sort of tied down. But he decides on moving his knight back here to queen 2, probably with the idea of coming up here and an eventual pawn to queen 4. Black wants to push a pawn, but not too early. He knows enough from Morphy not to free his game just by pushing pawns, but he has to maneuver his pieces in such a way that he can open the game and exchange pieces off in order to free himself. So after knight to queen 2, then finally Morphy does play a central move. Look where that knight came from. Came from b1 over to e3. It now has command of these white squares. Look at the coordination of the pieces here. This knight controls the white squares. This knight controls these central black squares. You notice that? Very strong knight position. Knight comes up here to bishop 4. Notice this knight can also maneuver around to come back here to king 3 and try and get somewhat of a position that Morphy has, but he does want to go pawn to queen. If he can get pawn to queen 4 in, he might be able to equalize the position. Bishop comes back. to bishop 2, all the way. The bishop had come out here, back here, back here. Again, I must tell you, in an open position, don't try and do this. Don't try and move your pieces around and maneuver them one piece so many times before you're developed. You can only do it if your position is locked, tight, defensive. Because if you start doing this in an open game where everything can move about, you're going to get caught and trapped. This knight then comes back here to king 3. He's got to find central position. However, both knights are on white squares. They're both attacking black squares, so their coordination are not as effective as these two knights. Can you follow that? The two knights are not as strong as these two knights. Morphy then plays pawn, over here, pawn to king rook 4. Now he hasn't castled, and he's starting to go to move his pawn up. He can only afford a flank attack. These are the little points I keep repeating, but they're points that might seem obvious to you, but they are part and parcel of the transformation of the theory of chess that took place at the time. If the center is locked, you can afford a flank attack. The only way for black to withstand the flank attack is to try and equalize by unlocking the center and get mobility. Pawn to king rook 4. You notice he is going to aim at this pawn, aiming at an exchange of pawns over here, which will give him an open rook file. Now there is one of the structural advantages that Steinitz is fighting for. He's fighting to open up this rook file. He wants to open it up by tearing it open, by exchanging pawns. He moves his pawn up to rook 4. I'll make one more move for black, and we'll discuss it. Pawn. I don't want to get lost here. Pawn to king rook 3. Now he goes back, knight to king 2. As I said, he wants to push pawn to queen 4. He has moved back here. He's desperate. He can see the attack coming up here. He wants to push. We'll leave it at this, and we'll take up the game next time we get together, and we'll study it further. Thanks for watching.